Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio. Today I'm going to be reviewing the solo mode for Foundations of Rome from designer Emerson Matsuuchi, and the solo mode being designed by David Turczi, publisher Arcane Wonders. In Foundations of Rome, this is a city building game, as you might expect, Rome. You're going to be placing these beautifully impressive 3D plastic buildings onto a central board, trying to arrange them in such a way to score the most points. Let's head over to the table. I'm going to show you just how the solo mode works. I'm not going to be giving you an overview of the entire game. We've actually done a review of the base game, and I'll link that video into the description of this one, so if you kind of want to know how the base game plays, you can check that out first. Here I'm just going to be talking about the solo mode. Then we'll come back here and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, here we see a starting setup for Foundations of Rome as a solo game. First thing I want to point out is that to be able to play this game as a solo game, you are going to need the Gardens of Ceres expansion. This is an expansion that is made up of a small deck of cards that you see right here, and a bag filled with garden tiles that look like this. The AI is not going to be placing the big plastic buildings out here on the main board like you are as a player. Here are my buildings. So you don't need those buildings in a second player color. They're going to be placing those garden tiles out there on the board. So really all you need other than your own components is you're going to need 8 lot markers for the AI of an unused color, and you'll just need the little cube to track their victory points and population tracker. All right, so on your turn, nothing really changes. You're going to play the game as if it were a standard multiplayer game, doing the same actions that you would there, either gaining income, building a building, or perhaps buying a deed. So let's say, for example, I wanted to go ahead and buy that B6 deed there. I would pay the 2 silver. You start with 5 as you would in a regular game, and you go ahead and place one of your lot markers out on the corresponding spot. Everything slides down. Nothing changes on your turn. You're going to be doing what you normally would. On the AI's turn, what you're going to be doing is this. They've got this deck that at the beginning of the game during setup, you have this deck shuffled and you put out an array of 4 cards. They're always going to have an array of 4 cards. In this starting array, we just happen to have all 3 types of cards that the AI has in their deck. So they've got claim deed cards, enlarge part cards, and bribe cards. Okay? And what you're going to do is this. You have an idea what they might do. You know they're going to do one of these actions. But what you don't know for sure is which one. So to figure that out, you flip up the top card of the deck and you're looking at this number. Okay? All of the cards have an action and a number here at the bottom of this little circle in the middle. So this is saying we're going to be evaluating the 3rd card in the array. And in this case, it says it's a bribe card. Bribing is very simple. What you're going to do is you're going to first look on the board and see if there are any of the commercial garden tiles on the board. These tiles here. Oops, let me get that more in frame. Those tiles, okay? In this case, they don't have any on the board, so it's just a standard of 1 coin. If there were others out there, you would add that to it. So let's say there were 2 of those other tiles, it would be 3. But in this case, there are none. So you would take 1 silver and you're going to place it on the leftmost card in the deed array there. That now makes that card more expensive for me to purchase. Normally it would have been 2, now it's going to be 3. It doesn't change anything for the AI, but it makes those cards more expensive for me. Once you have evaluated the card, what you do is you take the card that was evaluated, you place it face down at the bottom of the deck, you slide it over to fill the spots, and you put the card that you drew at the end. Okay? So that's very simple. That's how you do it. You flip over the top card, see which card gets evaluated, put it to the bottom of the deck, and add that to the array. So let's talk about the other cards that they might actually have. So for this claim deed card, this one is telling you that they're going to want to claim a deed. The first type of deed they're going to want is a G. If there's no G available, then B, then E. Okay? And there is a bit of a kind of order of operations if there are multiple different deeds that could fulfill what they're looking for. In this case, they're looking for a G, and there are 2 G cards out here. At the beginning of the game, there's really no decision to be made other than which of these 2 G cards, and in this case, they're going to be going for the cheapest one, which is the one on the left there, that G3. So in this case, you'd go ahead and take the G3, put it into their discard, and you're going to take one of the lot markers and place it on that spot, okay? Sometimes it'll be a card like this where it just says D, all right? Well, that's very simple. You're just going to be taking a D card from the array, and again, you're going to be doing it normally based upon other garden tiles that they have out there, because one garden tile is just that, a garden tile. But if you have multiple garden tiles that are orthogonally adjacent to each other, they become a park, which is something that could potentially score them points at the end of the game. And they're going to want to expand those parks. It's also going to be giving them grid bonuses at the end of the game, which you can see right here. So you want to kind of prevent the AI from getting these large blocks of their tiles together, because if they had a 4x4 grids at the end of the game, that's 48 victory points, which is no joke, all right? So they're going to continue to be taking their actions. You'll be taking your actions, perhaps putting out buildings. I don't know if I put those in the right spots, but you get the idea. You're going to be claiming deeds, putting out more of your lot markers, gaining income, things along those lines. They're eventually going to be getting to a point where they've put out a few of their lot markers, and then they're going to get this enlarged park 3 times. Okay, so when they enlarge their park, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be drawing tiles out of the bag and placing them on the board. So this is a population tile, and all of these different tiles are listed on the back of this card, okay? And so depending upon the difficulty that you choose at the beginning of the game, there are a couple of different types of residential tiles and commercial tiles. Some that have single icons like this, and some that have doubles. Let's see if I can quickly find, here's a double for you. All right, let's say we had one of those there. So depending upon the difficulty that you play at, in the normal difficulty, both of these tiles count as one population. So if this were the case and I was playing a normal game, right now the AI would have 2 population. If you were going to play on a harder difficulty, they would count as more, both for purposes of scoring, of population here, and of scoring, okay? So when you enlarge the park, you're going to be placing out these different garden tiles on the board that kind of represent the AI's buildings, all right? They're also going to be used when you're counting up their scoring at the end of the rounds and at the end of the game as well, all right? So those are the 3 different cards that the AI is going to have. They're going to be claiming deeds, they're going to be making these deed cards more expensive for you, and they're going to be placing their garden tiles out on the board, trying to enlarge these so that they can get those grid bonuses, and also so that they can score off of your buildings, because they also have civic tiles in here. Let me find some of these for you. Here's a civic tile right here. These civic tiles are going to be scoring based upon your building. So if you see here, Ceres is going to gain 2 victory points per your adjacent, let me get that in focus here, there we go, per your adjacent civic buildings, and they also have the any building tiles there as well, much like your buildings in your own array, okay? So you're going to play through the game over the 3 eras, just as you would in a normal game. You're going to have the scoring at the end of each of the eras, much like you would in the regular game. The population scoring works exactly the same. And if you have a higher score than the AI at the end of the game, you have won. Let's head over and I'll let you know what I think about it. Okay, well that was a very basic overview of how the solo game plays out in Foundations of Rome. And it's a relatively simple system all told, so didn't need to go into a tremendous amount of details getting into the nuts and bolts. I'll talk a little bit about that here in the meat of this review. The first thing I want to do is talk about some solo benchmarks. These are high-level ideas that I like to consider when I'm deciding whether to get a solo game off the shelf or not. The first thing is the win-loss condition. Is it a clear win or lose against an opponent, or are you playing a high score variant? And in the case of Foundations of Rome, you are playing against an opponent. And at the end of the game, if you've got more points than the AI, you win. If not, you lose. And I think that works well in this game. I think you probably could have even come up with a high score variant for a game like this because it's very much a puzzly type of game. But I do appreciate that you have a opponent that you're working against. It works quite well. And so depending upon what your preference is for solo gaming, if you do like a clear win-loss condition, I think you'll be happy to find that here. The other thing I want to talk about is setup and teardown. Now, this is not a small game. That is an understatement. It is a massive game with a large amount of components and large in volume and large in size. That being said, because of the storage solution that has been incorporated into this as a product, the setup and teardown is really not terribly cumbersome. It doesn't take a tremendous amount of time. And that's important because the game itself is not a terribly long game to play. So I feel like the ratio on this is fine. If they didn't have such a well thought out and constructed storage system, that might have been a negative. But in the case of Foundations of Rome, it's not a negative because, again, the setup is not terribly cumbersome or time consuming because of the storage solution that's incorporated within it. And the next thing I like to talk about is rules. And in the case of the solo mode for Foundations of Rome, it has a separate solo rule book. It comes within this small expansion box. And I think that it does that very well. The base game rules are relatively simple. This is not a terribly complex game. It's a medium, on the light end of medium in my opinion, Euro board game. And the rules for the solo variant are very clear, very well discussed. And when there are things that might give areas of ambiguity, I think they do a good job of giving examples of that, whether it comes to scoring or if there are multiple deed cards that you may be having to choose from. It does a nice job of kind of describing how that works. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that further along in the review. So overall, the rules are done well. I like that they are kind of in their own individual book, and it feels like they didn't have to scrimp on the amount of space because it has its own rule book. Okay, the next thing I'd like to talk about is art and components, and this is going to be a little bit out of the ordinary in the sense that we've already reviewed the base game, and the art and the components, especially the components, are really a huge selling point for this game. There's just no two ways about it. These incredibly impressive plastic buildings that are out there on the board are going to have some of the most impressive table presence you're likely to ever come across. And so, do I really account for that in this review where I'm specifically talking about the solo mode? I'm not going to. I do think that the components in this game across the board are stunning. They're stellar. But let's just talk about what's in this box, okay? There's not a lot. There's just a small deck of cards. That being said, the cards are very functional. They're very easy to read. They're not convoluted, and they look good with the rest of the game. They keep a similar aesthetic. It doesn't look jarring. It doesn't look out of place, and that's good. The other thing is, this may be counterintuitive, and some people may disagree with me on this, but I'm glad that they didn't try to come up with a system that incorporated getting another whole player tray and putting out a second color of buildings on the board. Now, at the end of the game, it might look more impressive that way, where you've got essentially what would look like a standard two-player game at the end, where you've got 2 players worth of buildings out there. Sure, that looks great, but on a practical frame of reference, I appreciated that I was just accounting for my buildings and those garden tiles were representing the AIs. I thought it still looked lovely on the board, but it was so much easier for me to administer, to not have to deal with a second set of buildings. I'm sure they could have tried to work that into the solo design. I'm glad they didn't. And again, that may seem counterintuitive because, sure, more buildings the better, but at the cost of having to administer another whole tray of buildings, I'm glad they went the route they did. Okay, the overall solo experience. First off, I'm going to talk about something that was a little disappointing, and then I'll talk about the things that I liked. The negative that kind of jumped out at me is that this is a game, Foundations of Rome, that has a number of different modules that you can add to the experience to kind of keep it fresh, change things up a little bit. As I mentioned a moment ago, the core game itself is Not the most complex of games. There's nothing wrong with that. Games don't have to be complex. But there may not be a whole lot of variability from game to game. You're going to essentially be having a very similar experience from one game to the next. And so those added modules that you can put into the multiplayer game can kind of change things up. In the solo game, most of them are not compatible. You can only play with the Monuments expansion. And so that is something to keep in mind, that many of the things that were incorporated within the base game to kind of change that up, to add some variety, are not compatible with the solo mode. And so that is something that you would have to keep in mind. Now, the positives, the things that worked well for me. Tying into that, the fact that this game is a relatively simple game to learn and to teach and to play, I'm really glad that they kept the AI card system simple to administer. It would have been, I think, jarring if you are taking your turns, which again are very simple. You're getting income, or you're placing out a building, or you're getting a lot card. Really quick, very simple turns. If you then had to go through a convoluted, complex process for the AI to take their turn, that would be a negative for me. I've mentioned this in the past, that I want to have a good ratio. I want to be spending at least as much time on my turn, if not potentially more, than I am on the AI's turn. And they kept this, I believe, as simple as they could have. Now, there are going to be some kind of cases where you have to do a little bit of going through a bit of a spreadsheet is much too strong of a term, but you have to go through a bit of an order of operations to kind of administer, okay, where is this garden tile going to be going? Where is this lot token going to be going? Which of these deed cards am I going to be getting? But thankfully, it's not a very complex or lengthy process. And once you kind of internalize that system, it's very quick. You're going just as quick on the AI's turn, probably quicker than you are on your own turn. And that's a huge positive in a solo game, in my opinion. Another positive is that, to me, this still feels like you're playing Foundations of Rome. They did not have to change the core experience of the game to make it a solo game. And sometimes that's not the case. Oftentimes you'll have games that are set up as multiplayer games, and they put in a solo mode that allows you to play it solitaire, but it doesn't feel like the same game. This feels like the same game. You're still taking the same actions. Scoring still essentially works the same way, with some slight differences on how the AI scores, but it's still within the general framework of the game, and so that's good. Another positive is that it's very easy to adjust the difficulty in this game. If you find that you are consistently beating the AI, it is not difficult at all to adjust and make it much more difficult, make it much more challenging for you as the solo player. And so that is also a big positive for me. So lots of positives, many more positives than negatives, but I feel like there's a bit of a elephant in the room, perhaps. That may not be the best turn of phrase. That might be a little bit hackneyed, but I'm going to go with it. Can I recommend this strictly as a solo game? And this is where I struggle. The short answer is no. I don't feel comfortable recommending this as a solo-only game, strictly because of the way that this product is right now, and that's very vague. Let me get more specific. This is a very large game with a lot of components, some of the most impressive components, one of the most impressive and outstanding productions that I've ever seen. The flip side to that is that it's not cheap. And I don't usually talk about costs or value in my reviews. That's not typically the route that I go. But I feel like in this case, it makes sense, because people oftentimes will ask me about games that are multiplayer games, primarily, that have a solo mode implemented. Would you recommend this as only a solo? I'm only a solo player, or I very, very rarely would be playing this multiplayer. When the question is framed to me like that, then value comes into it a little bit more. Now, if you absolutely adore this game and you're going to get play after play after play after play after play as a solo player, then maybe it would be worth it for you. But I do wonder if that's the case. I wonder if there's enough variability in there to recommend it strictly as a solo game. And so this is where it gets tricky to me, because I think as a multiplayer game, it's very, very good. And I recommend it easily as a multiplayer game. I also recommend it as a solo game if you are getting it as a as an addition to the multiplayer experience. If you know that you like this game and you're going to be playing it as a multiplayer game, often enough, as often as you would feel comfortable, but you also want to be able to play it as a solo game, it's a really, really good solo mode. It does everything that just about everything that I'm looking for in a solitaire experience for a game like this. Simple to administer, AI system, setup and teardown is good. All of those things that I look for in a solo game are here. And so this is where I really come into a conundrum. I'm going to be giving the solo mode of Foundations of Rome an 8 out of 10. Clearly a recommendation, but I feel like I have to put a bit of a caveat in there. It's an 8 out of 10, yes, and it is recommended, yes, but I don't know that I would feel comfortable recommending this strictly as a solo game if you're not going to be playing it multiplayer at all, because I don't know if the value is there. Again, value is a very, very tricky thing, and what is affordable to one person may not be affordable to another person. Everybody's experience is different. And if you are looking into whether you would want to maybe play this if it was somebody else's copy, yes, 100%. I recommend this as a solo game, but do I recommend it strictly as a solo game? That's where it gets a little bit tricky for me. So kind of take that into account when you are, if you are considering this as a purchase. But if you're looking for it, just does it do what it should be doing as a solo game? Yes, it does, 100%. An 8 out of 10. Can I recommend it as a strictly solo purchase? That's where it gets tough for me. All right, well, that's it for me. This is Mike DiLisio signing off from Dice Tower headquarters.